Hello, this is Teresa and welcome back for another video tutorial. I'm doing a collaboration with Justine Hovey, Laurel Beard, Lindsay Adrian, and myself. We're going to be sharing some different techniques that will show you how to get back to basics and make some simple cards. I've chosen to concentrate on background stamps and how versatile they are, and other than just stamping a simple background, different ways that you might be able to use them. So my first example is showing you how this particular style of background stamp, which is more of a mixed media, kind of a grungy looking stamp, can be converted into something that is more elegant. And by the time I'm done with this, I'll have two different cards that will be for an anniversary as well as a wedding card. So my first example, I'm just using some white cardstock. I've stamped with Versamark ink onto this piece of cardstock. I'm removing a little bit of the gold embossing powder and I will heat set that off camera. And then I'm using a piece of craft cardstock and stamping again in Versamark ink. And this time the thing I will do differently is I'm going to use some Pearl X powder and a little brush, and I'm going to apply that across the panel by just brushing it across, and it will adhere to the embossing ink. This is a very simple way to make a background that's elegant looking, and you could use a lot of different colors to make a different tone-on-tone effect depending on what type of card you want to make. So now you get the idea of what it looks like when you just simply brush it with that powder. Now I'm going back to the gold emboss panel that I just made, and I'm adding just a touch of Distress Oxide ink to this. I'm using Tattered Rose because I just want a little bit of a blush color, and I'm not going to put this over the entire background but just on a part of it. And one of the things I'll end up doing so that I can create two different cards is I will end up cutting an oval die cut out of the center of this, which will leave me with not only the oval die cut, but the frame that goes with it. And I'll create two different cards with that. And so I've used both those pieces. I have the oval on the right with the Mr. and Mrs. die cut out of it, and then I used the frame that was left on the card on the left hand side to create a different card. I used some vellum in the center and die cut Happy Anniversary to go on that card. Now my second idea is how to combine a stencil and a stamp. So I'm using a striped stamp, which is very versatile in itself, and I'm using this Harlequin style stencil on top of that. Then I'm going to use some ink, and I'll show you two different examples. The first one is with Catherine Pooler ink, which is a dye ink, and it is a very juicy ink, and this technique will work best if you have a very juicy ink. So now that I've stamped across both the stamp and the stencil, I'm applying the paper down to that, and I'm pressing down and making sure not to move the actual cardstock, but just hold it in place while I rub it against the ink on the stencil and the stamp. And so that leaves me with this result. And when I remove the stencil, I'm going to stamp the back of that piece of paper so you can see what it looks like if you just turn it around and stamp what's left of the ink on the stamp itself. And I also decided to try this with some VersaFine Clear ink, and I'm making sure to add plenty of ink on this before I put down my piece of paper and rub on top of it to transfer all that ink to my background. And again, if you want to use the rest of the ink, you could also apply a different piece of paper and transfer the ink to another piece of cardstock. And this time I just put it on the back of that one to show you the difference. And here are a couple of cards I made using those types of backgrounds. And my third and favorite idea is using this particular stamp from Hero Arts. It is a wave stencil, not stencil, but a stamp, background stamp. And I've discovered a great use for some black embossing powder on top of black cardstock. So I'm going to use the Versamark ink onto the background stamp and stamp that down. And once I have done that, I'm going to use the super fine detail black embossing powder to create the background for one of the cards. Actually, I'll be able to make a couple of cards out of this one particular background. And so now that I've added that ink, I'm going to emboss this with the black Wow embossing powder, and it gives a really cool result because you end up with a piece that looks very shiny in texture. And so I think I have found my new favorite use for black embossing powder is using it on black paper. Now to emboss this, I started by heating up the back of the paper first after I had heated up my heat tool for about 45 seconds. And I'm using a tool that has, I'll say, a pointy end on it to hold the paper in place while I'm melting the embossing powder, which does take a while since I've covered this entire background. The result, I promise, is worth it because the paper ends up looking like it's very shiny, and it has a wonderful texture from that wave background. And I end up using the same background to create a few different looks for this and create some stunning cards. So now I'm using a piece of white cardstock and adding Versamark ink back to the same stamp. And I'm going to make sure that I get a good impression and coverage from that ink. And this time I'm going to experiment by using some different colored embossing powders. I'm just grabbing some and sprinkling it directly onto the paper. I'm not going to be able to reuse this powder because it will be mixed up by the time I shake it off of the card, so I'm just using as little as possible. Now, when you're trying techniques like this, sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't work out as well. I will have to say I wasn't quite as happy with the result of this experiment, but however, the result was good enough that I thought it could still be useful. I could use this finished piece for some die cuts. As you can see, there was a lot of splotches of yellow, so I don't end up using it in this video to make a card. The final thing that I'm going to be doing with this same stamp is I'm going to be stamping with Versamark VersaFine black ink, which is a pigment black ink, and it also stays wet long enough so that you can add embossing powder to it. I will be using clear embossing powder on this particular background, and then I'll show you how I put together all the different cards using a combination of the black on black background and this black on white background. And I think you'll find this is pretty cool. It turned out to be my very favorite of all the three techniques, and I think you'll see why in a moment. I'm adding some clear embossing powder, which I prefer to use versus black, even when I'm using a black ink and want that result. Now here is my finished black and white panel, and now you can see all the different ones I created using that same background. Now I'm using two different rectangle dies, and I'm doing this so that I'll end up with three different pieces. I'm going to have a frame on the outside, a small frame in between, and then the square in the middle. So I'm just taping those together. I've already die cut them off screen, and now I'm going to separate all the pieces, and I will use all three of them in my cards. So using a piece of pink cardstock as a background, I'm going to put on my outer layer and inner panel and use the other frame for the other card. I'm already going to have some flowers that I will layer on to my different backgrounds here. And I have done another 2 backgrounds in the same black and white configuration that I'm die cutting my sentiments out of. And now I have everything glued together. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I hope you've enjoyed these cards, and be sure to check out the other videos on this video collaboration. Thank you.